Trying to bury a small problem is usually what turns it into a big one. In 2003, an entertainer spotted a single aerial photograph of her home inside a huge, public online archive documenting the California coastline. The archive held thousands of similar images, all taken for an environmental survey. Nobody was studying her house specifically. Before she acted, that one photo had been downloaded a handful of times by researchers, students, maybe a few curious locals. It was background noise in a database nobody outside a small circle even knew existed. Instead of ignoring it, she sued the photographer, demanding the image be taken down and asking for damages. That lawsuit is what changed everything. Court filings are public. Journalists cover lawsuits, especially lawsuits filed by famous people over something as mundane as a photograph. Once the story broke, people who had never heard of the archive, never cared about coastline erosion, and never once thought about that house went looking for the photo anyway, purely because someone had tried so hard to make it disappear. Before long, that image had been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people. The lawsuit did not remove the photo from public consciousness. It installed the photo in public consciousness, permanently. Years later, researchers studying online behavior needed a name for this exact pattern, and they landed on the Streisand effect, after the entertainer whose lawsuit made the case famous. The definition is simple enough to fit in one sentence. An attempt to suppress a piece of information often draws far more attention to it than simply leaving it alone ever would have. What makes the story worth remembering isn't the lawsuit itself. It's how small the original fact was. A photo of a house sitting quietly in an obscure database was never going to become a story on its own. The lawsuit is the only reason anyone remembers it today. Here's the mechanism, and it isn't complicated once you see it. Suppression itself is newsworthy. The original piece of information almost never is. A photo of a coastline house is boring. Nobody assigns a reporter to cover real estate photography. But a wealthy, famous person suing a photographer to hide a picture of her house that has a story built in already, money, power, secrecy, and someone visibly trying to control what the public can see. That combination is irresistible to journalists and to ordinary curious people alike. It suggests there might be something worth hiding, even when there isn't. The moment an organization introduces a legal threat, a deletion, a gag order, or a carefully worded denial, something shifts. It hands its audience a second, far juicier layer sitting right on top of the first boring one: control. People are drawn to stories about secrecy and control far more than they were ever drawn to whatever mundane fact was actually being hidden. This is not a quirk of one lawsuit in 2003. It's a stable feature of how attention works. A fact, on its own, competes for attention against millions of other facts, and it usually loses because most facts are unremarkable. But a fact plus a visible, heavy-handed effort to hide that fact is no longer competing as a fact. It's now competing as a mystery, and mysteries are far stickier than facts. Audiences don't need to understand or care about the original issue to get pulled into a story about someone trying to make it disappear. That's why The Backfire is so consistent. It doesn't depend on the seriousness of what's being hidden. A trivial complaint and a genuine scandal generate the exact same backfire pattern, because the backfire isn't about the content, it's about the visible act of suppression layered on top of the content. This exact pattern plays out inside companies all the time, and it rarely gets called by its proper name. Picture a customer posting a minor product complaint on social media, the kind of post that would ordinarily get a handful of replies and quietly disappear from the feed within a day. Instead of a quiet, direct reply, legal sends a heavy-handed threat, demanding the post come down and implying consequences if it doesn't. The moment that threat becomes visible, and it almost always does, because the recipient screenshots it before complying, the story changes completely. It's no longer a customer's complaint about a product. It's a company throwing lawyers at an ordinary person for stating an opinion. That new story is far more shareable than the original complaint ever was, because it has a clear villain and a clear underdog. Screenshots of the legal threat spread across timelines the original complaint never would have reached, tagged with commentary about corporate bullying. The company's own attempt at containment becomes the headline, while the actual product issue gets buried under a much bigger story about how the company treats its customers. Or picture an internal memo describing a mistake, maybe a shipping error, maybe a flawed decision made by a manager under pressure. Someone with authority scrubs that memo from the shared drive and quietly asks employees not to discuss it further without explaining why. That silence does not stop the conversation. It redirects it. Most employees never even read the memo before it vanished, so they can't discuss the actual mistake even if they wanted to. What they can discuss, and will discuss at length, is the deletion itself. Why did it disappear? Why were we told to stay quiet? Speculation fills that gap, and speculation is almost always worse than reality, because people default to their worst assumptions when given no information. A minor shipping error can, through weeks of breakroom speculation, mutate into rumors about a much bigger cover-up, none of it true, all of it more damaging to trust than the original mistake ever was. The company did not contain its problem. It traded a small, explainable mistake for an unexplainable one, and unexplainable problems erode trust the longest, because there's never a clean moment where the story resolves. It just lingers, quietly, for weeks. Or picture a leaked internal disagreement, two executives arguing about strategy in a thread that somehow gets forwarded outside its intended circle. Leadership's response is an all-hands message demanding silence, sometimes hinting at consequences for anyone who disobeys. That demand instantly becomes the most interesting thing that's happened all month. Before the message, maybe a dozen people even knew the disagreement existed, and most had already moved on. After the message, the entire building is talking about it, not because the original disagreement was dramatic, but because leadership's visible panic made it feel like it must be. The demand for silence is what actually converted a minor disagreement into the thing everyone quietly discusses at lunch for the next 2 weeks. Widen the lens past those three, because this pattern shows up in more places than most managers expect. Consider a former employee who writes an honest, mildly critical blog post about their time at a company. Nothing defamatory, just an account of their own experience. The kind of post dozens of ex-employees write every year that almost nobody reads. If the company's legal team responds with a cease and desist letter, threatening that former employee over the post, it hands the story a headline it never had before. A company trying to silence someone who used to work there. Tech journalists and employee review forums both love that headline far more than they ever would have loved the original blog post. Legal threats like this reliably become public. Once that happens, the same post can reach tens of thousands of readers, now accompanied by commentary about the company's culture, its legal aggression, and how it treats people who leave. Consider an executive reviewing results from an internal engagement survey ahead of a board meeting. One number looks bad. Morale in a particular department has clearly cratered, and it doesn't fit the story the executive wants to tell. The executive asks for that slide to be pulled, or for the number to be softened so it reads more favorably. Requests like that have a habit of becoming visible anyway. Maybe it's a leftover comment in a shared document. Maybe it's a board member who remembers last quarter's number and asks a pointed follow-up question. Once it surfaces, the story stops being about one disappointing number in one department. It becomes a story about an executive editing the truth in front of the people whose entire job is to oversee the company. Boards do not forgive that easily, because from that point on, the concern isn't the original number, it's whether anything else in that deck was also quietly adjusted. Consider a PR team managing a public post that starts attracting a wave of critical comments. Rather than replying, or letting the comments run their course and fade naturally, the team quietly deletes them one by one. Deletion at scale gets noticed almost immediately because someone in that comment section is usually screenshotting as they go. What follows is a compilation post. Screenshots get lined up side by side, showing exactly which comments vanished and how quickly. It gets captioned with something like, "Watch this company delete every piece of criticism in real time." The original criticism might have been forgotten within a day. The deletion becomes durable evidence instead, evidence that lives in screenshots long after the actual comments are gone, evidence of a company that cannot tolerate feedback. Here's the part nobody expects going into this. The fix is almost embarrassingly simple, and most leaders resist it anyway. The fix is not silence, and it's not doing nothing. Doing nothing at all, in a genuinely serious situation, can look like negligence. The fix is proportionality. Respond quietly and directly, at the scale the problem actually deserves, instead of escalating to control the narrative. Take that product complaint again. A short, honest reply almost always outperforms silence. Something like, "You're right, we should have shipped that better. Here's exactly what we're doing about it." It dramatically outperforms a legal threat too. It signals confidence rather than fear, because only a company that feels exposed reaches for lawyers over a single social media post. And critically, it gives the story nowhere to go. There's no secrecy left for anyone to be curious about. No gap for speculation to fill. No villain for the internet to rally against. Take the internal memo example, since it's the one that tends to do the most quiet damage over time. Instead of deleting the memo and demanding silence, a far better move is a short, plain, follow-up message. Here's what happened. Here's what we're doing differently. Here's who to ask if you have questions. That message doesn't erase the mistake, and it isn't supposed to. What it removes is the mystery around the mistake. And mystery, not the mistake itself, is what fuels office speculation for weeks afterward. Employees don't actually need the problem to disappear. They need to feel like they're being told the truth instead of being managed through omission. A team that explains its own mistakes plainly and quickly tends to earn more trust after a stumble, sometimes more than a team that never stumbled at all. The explanation itself becomes proof that leadership treats people like adults, capable of hearing bad news. That's a strange, counterintuitive result, but it holds up consistently. The visible willingness to explain a mistake builds more credibility than the absence of mistakes ever could, because everyone already knows mistakes happen. What people actually watch for is how leadership behaves once one does. The same logic applies to the board deck and the deleted comments. An executive who includes the bad morale number with a short explanation and a plan to address it looks competent and in control. An executive caught hiding it looks like someone managing perception instead of managing the business. A PR team that leaves criticism visible and replies to the 2 or 3 comments that raise a fair point looks like a company secure enough to be criticized in public. A PR team that quietly deletes everything looks like a company that can't survive contact with its own customers. None of this means transparency is painless, and nobody should pretend it is. Explaining a mistake still stings. Owning a bad number in front of a board still stings. Leaving public criticism visible instead of deleting it still feels uncomfortable every time. But painful and small beats, dramatic and large, every time this pattern plays out. A quiet, direct acknowledgement costs a company one uncomfortable afternoon. A heavy-handed suppression effort can cost months of headlines, a permanent evidence trail of screenshots, and employee trust that took years to build. Every one of these workplace stories, the product complaint, the deleted memo, the leaked disagreement, the cease and desist letter, the softened board number, the deleted comments, follows the exact same shape as that 2003 lawsuit over a single photograph. A small, forgettable fact gets set on fire by a big, visible attempt to smother it. And it's the attempt, not the original fact, that people can't look away from. So here's the practical takeaway for anyone managing a team, a brand, or a company's reputation. Before you move to contain a small problem, stop and ask one question. Is my containment effort more newsworthy than the problem itself? If a lawyer's letter, a deleted post, or a gag order would make a better headline than the original issue ever could, you're about to manufacture your own crisis entirely by hand. That single habit is worth more than any crisis plan. Match your response to the actual size of the problem, say it plainly, and let small things stay small. Hit follow if that surprised you.